Hello and welcome back to the Games Institute podcast. As always, I'm your host, Marisa Benjamin.
And I'm your co-host, Tobin Rossico.
You say
I got
that
new glasses.
I'm co-host too. We're both co-hosts. Nice glasses.
Thanks. They're from Walmart.
Nice.
Love
That's
them.
the way to do it. And today we are joined by none other than Sabrina Sgandurra.
That was a perfect pronunciation. I'm so happy.
Yes. I'm so excited to have you on the podcast. And if anybody is watching this right now, you might notice that Tobin and I are matching because we are here with the editor-in-chief of First Person Scholar.
I should be wearing mine, but I have no idea where my shirt went.
That's okay because you embody it. You walk around being First Person Scholar, one of the faces of First Person Scholar, t-shirt or not.
Yeah. And it's COVID. I mean, I haven't worn pants since like 2019 probably.
COVID-19, 2019. Yeah, I guess that checks out. Yeah. We'll forget about January and February. But Sabrina, I'm so thrilled to have you on the podcast because you might be maybe not the only person, but certainly to me, the person that comes to mind when I think about somebody who started the whole Games Institute timeline with me properly. Because when I was baby staff, you were baby master student.
Yes, that is accurate.
And I was kind of pitching to you a little bit to join the Games Institute, although you did know about it before then.
Mm-hmm.
So the pitch was really easy. And let's have you describe your research in a sentence. And if you can recall it, describe it in sort of the same sentence you might have used 3 years ago when I first met you and you said you wanted to join.
Jeez, okay. What did I say 3 years ago? I probably said something along the lines of I study narrative structures in single-player RPG video games. That sounds about right. And that's still very much true, but it's a little more refined now. Now it's I look at what narrative preferences single-player RPGs use, what that sort of relates to in terms of our history of literature, and what that might say about cultural preferences for a certain type of story.
Fantastic. We're going to get into so much more of that, as well as your connections with First Person Scholar, what it actually means to be editor-in-chief throughout the next, I guess we have a little under 50 minutes. So this is going to be a quick episode, but definitely stacked with info.
It'll be the shortest podcast in 2 years.
Yeah, exactly. Because we have a timeline. Otherwise, we would totally talk for 2 hours easily. Yeah. But let's start off with our icebreaker question.
All right, Sabrina, what is your earliest childhood memory of playing games? And that can be video, card, board games, playground, anything like that.
As a bystander, probably. I think one of my earliest memories is I come from an Italian background. Playing card games and board games is very big for us. And I'm pretty sure one of my earliest memories is watching, I don't know if it was my dad or my grandmother when she was still alive, basically the family playing this Italian card game called Scoppa. And it uses a very specific card deck. If you Google Sicilian cards, they'll look up, you'll be able to look it up, and they look very different. They almost look like tarot cards in a weird way.
That's cool.
But it's definitely not at all the same as a tarot card reading. It's you basically have to match points, and I can't even explain it because I always have to get a refresher when we play. So, but yeah, I remember being the bystander to that. So never actually getting to play it until I was a bit older.
Yeah, we used to play Scopa every time we would visit my grandparents when we went to see them in Brantford before my nonno passed away.
Yeah.
And it's the art on the cards are so beautiful. Now as an adult, I can appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. When I was a kid, they looked just really weird. And I remember because I didn't speak much Italian when I was a bit younger, so I used to just refer to the donna as the lady, because they would just give me the English translations for everything except for the coins. That was the one word that never got translated, and it was just always the denari.
Yeah.
I don't know why.
Do you remember the first game that you would have played?
It was either going to be one of those card games, or it was maybe Monopoly. maybe Monopoly was the first one, or Pictionary, because we were also big into board games too. Yeah, I think so. I don't know. You're asking me to remember things that are longer than I care to admit ago because my birthday is in a month and I don't like it.
Well, what about video game?
Video game, that would have been with my brothers, and it probably would have been Ocarina of Time or Mario Party. Yeah.
Oh,
So
cool.
N64 era.
Yeah, because I was the youngest of a bunch of older boy cousins and my two brothers, so we were always together playing video games, and it was almost all on the N64. I think. Oh, wait a minute! I do remember playing the Sega, but I don't remember what game it was. But I just remember the controller. But it was probably one of the baseball games for the Sega, because that seems to stick out in my head. But that I can barely remember that. So.
We've got a nice mix in here. We've covered card games, board games, video games.
Yeah. Definitely a big family of gamers to some extent.
Yeah, but when did role-playing games come into it for you?
That started, even though like Ocarina of Time isn't a role-playing game, it's classified as an action-adventure. I would argue it's a role-playing game, but that's a can of worms for another day.
Yeah, but that has to be part 2 because I have thoughts about that.
Probably disagreeing.
Yeah, it's not a role-playing game. It's a puzzle game.
Okay, we'll get into that later. Yeah, I think that would have been my first introduction into that sort of role-playing-esque game, and then I think after that, the one I can remember that sticks out the most, but there was probably something before this, was Kingdom Hearts on the PS2, I want to say.
Yep.
That was because I used to be more of the bystander rather than the player. I used to like watching play, and then when Kingdom Hearts came out, that's when I started sort of getting into it a little bit, but I kept erasing my brother's save files, so I wasn't allowed to touch it after a while.
I did that too. I had a very traumatic experience where I cleared out all the data for my brother's Star Fox 64 account, and he was like 2 levels away from like 100%ing it. And yeah, the conversations that happened after that were not good. So I can. So what was the first console where you kind of had ownership or dominion over it, or do you have that?
That didn't happen until I was 16. I was stealing my brother's Xbox 360s all the time because, like, it was always for the kids, but one of us would put in more than the other, and that happened to be usually one of my brothers. So I kept stealing it, and they kept getting really annoyed with me because I was hogging it. Because at that point, I was really starting to get into video games. Oddly enough, first-person shooters. And so then my aunt, for my 16th birthday, I'm pretty sure it was my 16th birthday, bought me my own 360. So we had 3 Xbox 360s in the house, which was ridiculous, all because none of us wanted to share or do split screen. And then after that, it was like very quickly after that, I finally started getting into Assassin's Creed, and that's when like the love of RPGs and researching games started to come out.
There we go. Yeah, I'm trying to understand you as a gamer. And what I'm hearing is you have a lot of instances of playing with family, card games, board games, all of that. But when you really start to light up, I think is when you start talking about your experience playing the game solo.
Yeah, I'm very much, I don't know if this is because I used to struggle with making friends when I was a bit younger. And which is weird because I'm definitely a social butterfly now. But I used to struggle with that, so I really liked the escapism that came with the single player games, and also not to knock my brothers because we all have a lovely relationship now. But they used to like critique me a little bit. I know they were trying to help me, but it used to drive me nuts. I'm like, don't tell me how to play the game. I tried Skyrim, and then like 15 minutes into it, my brother was critiquing me, and I'm like, you know what? Never touching this game again, and I have yet to play it because of that instance. Whereas when I finally got my own 360 and I started to play Assassin's Creed Brotherhood, that was like I basically dominated that realm. And after that, it was like, I just want to play single player games. Screw everybody else. Which is a bit different now. I do like playing multiplayer games now, but.
With that framing, let's get into your academic journey. Oh my gosh, losing language. Sip of water. Yeah, let's dig into your academic journey to figure out where you went from being a gamer in your personal life for pleasure, and then tied it into what you're actually doing for school, and then what you can do in your career.
Okay, so I started doing, like, when I was 16, I started researching the historical accuracy of Assassin's Creed games. And then I'm like, oh, maybe this is what I want to do. So I did English because I liked analyzing stories. And then I started to think, like, well, maybe I actually just like studying history. So I almost thought about switching programs. And then ultimately, I don't know what ended up deciding, like, making me decide to just stay. So I stuck with it. But I sort of switched gears and, like, oh, nobody really cares about whether I want to analyze a game or not. There's no future in that, wrongfully so. I thought that. So I thought I would become a Victorianist because I really liked Jane Austen. And then fourth year, I think, yeah, it was fourth year, I was talking to a professor about video games, and she's like, well, why are you thinking about doing, like, because I knew I wanted to do a master's and a PhD, and she's like, but why are you thinking about doing Victorianism if this is clearly something you enjoy much more? And I'm like, because I didn't know this was an option. And she's like, she told me to take one specific undergrad course in my fourth year. So I did that. And then shortly after that, that was a narrative in the digital age, I want to say, taught by Dr. Jason Boyd, who I still every once in a while talk to. He's fantastic. He works with some of our staff that's at FPS. And then I hopped from that to doing an independent undergrad thesis with him. And then that's when he started showing me, he's like, yeah, so there's an entire world out here for this exact thing you want to research. You should go look at Waterloo. And then also a smattering of others. And then that's when I found FPS. And that's when I was like, hey, this is what I want to do.
So this was at Ryerson? That's where you did your undergrad?
At Ryerson, yeah.
Oh, and this professor told you about Waterloo for the Games Institute?
Yeah, he was because he, in our undergrad class, narrative in the digital age, we read some FPS articles. So yeah, so I became like a fangirl over FPS pre getting to Waterloo. I thought it was like the biggest deal in everything. So then he said, if you're thinking about doing a master's, first of all, I think this is fantastic. You should totally do it. Your ideas are great, which was nice of him to say. And then he said, look at Waterloo for the Games Institute, look at Concordia for the Tag Lab. And then he gave me a smattering of others. But it was sort of those two that he was like, those are the two you're going to want to really look at. And the benefit with Waterloo is that it houses FPS. And I was like, well, if I'm already fangirling over FPS, I might as well. So I applied, and then I talked to Neil my first day I got here during my MA, and at that point, like, the rest is history. Like, I was hook, line, and sinker, basically.
Yeah, done deal, life sealed.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a really, really interesting, I don't know, story of coming full circle. And I suppose you're gonna have many more circles to come full circle too over the course of the rest of your career. But I mean, I'm going to play ignorant here for a second and just ask you, how is it possible that you can be very interested in Victorian literature and history, but then find another passion in video games? Is there a connection there, or is that random?
No, there's definitely a connection. So as much as a kid, I hated reading, I really like stories, period. So for years, I was like all about Shakespeare. And then I ended up finding Jane Austen. I was all about Jane Austen. And then I fell in love with medieval literature when I finally got exposure to that. And Ryerson doesn't have medieval literature as like a strong strain, or at least it didn't when I was there for undergrad, but there was miniature like versions of exposure to it. So I was like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. And obviously I love Lord of the Rings. This is great. So in a way, I think where it comes from is that I just like stories and a good story in general, and it can be very different. I don't really have a good definition of what makes a good story. I really don't. I wish I did. But I think what ended up happening was I was seeing like my brain work the same way it would when I'm analyzing a story, or when I can just see the words, is what I used to say. When I'm reading something, it happens more so with games. Like, it just makes my brain start to light up and So the connection is not necessarily with the era or the genre, although you could definitely draw those. It's more just the act of telling stories and consuming stories is the part that sort of drew that bridge. And then there's, of course, with the history aspect, I just really like historical trivia. So when it's a game like Assassin's Creed, especially the earlier ones where they're all about that being rooted in that history, that's where that ties in. Like I just really like that kind of stuff. I'm just a nerd like that.
Wow. When you are playing a game, can you explain to us? Here's the thing. I don't have this connection or this feeling that you just described, and I'm very, very jealous of it. And let's just blame it on the fact that I don't actually play a lot of these games. The games that I play are much more about the social element. So
Okay.
the narrative is outside of the game, possibly.
Okay.
So
Yep.
for people like me, can you explain what it's like to interact with the narrative in a game, and what do you notice? What appeals to you?
Yeah, so this might get a little bit like heavy, but basically I think it stems from this sort of sense of, or lack thereof rather, sense of belonging. I've never fully felt comfortable in most situations. I usually feel or I used to at least, feel very misunderstood. So the interaction with the stories, especially single player, I'm allowed to jump in and experience a story that I maybe wish I had or just would like to know what it's like. And it kind of feels like somebody's finally talking to me. And it's sort of the same thing. I get this with music a lot too. It's a little bit different. With music, it's on one hand, I'm able to finally communicate, whereas on the story side of it, specifically with video games, somebody's actually speaking to me and I can understand. I don't know if that's making sense, but it's basically it's escapism but with extra steps.
Yeah,
Like,
I would think it's like the immersion element. It's escapism, but you're immersed in it and you feel like you're a part of it.
yeah, exactly. But then it's also at a safe distance. So and this is why I won't do horror games, because that's too much immersion. And like I can't handle it. Whereas a game that's high fantasy or I'm blanking on genres right now, or
Science
whatever.
fiction,
Yeah.
post-apocalyptic.
Thank you. Science fiction. That was the one I was trying to remember for a second. I don't know what's wrong with my brain. When it's anything other than horror, basically, I can be in a world that isn't quite as confusing as my own, and then through that I can work out my own. And I'm not necessarily doing it consciously, but like I'll pull an idea from a good story. Like, oh, you know what? This makes sense to me. Therefore, I'm going to use this in my actual life. And it's not necessarily conscious. Sometimes it is, but a lot of the time it isn't.
So that's really interesting. I actually I watch a lot of game developers conference talks
Mm-hmm.
because I'm obsessed with game design, but I have to convince myself that I'm never actually going to design a game because that's a path I don't want to go down. But he was a behavioral psychologist, I think. So Marisa, you'd be interested in this too. And he talks about how this idea of like freedom in games is a fallacy, and players don't want freedom; they want volition or like a better sense of agency.
Mm-hmm.
And he talks about specifically there's three examples that he gives, but I only remember the two. So one of them is Skyrim, and how it's just like there's too much and you're not really creating a story, you're essentially just creating a character, right? Because like you're
Yes.
the thieves guild head and you're the mage guild head, like it's all these different titles but they don't really impact the main narrative.
Mm-hmm.
But then the example that he gives of like true volition in games, and this is why I'm still surprised that you haven't played Mass Effect, is because Mass Effect is where that succeeds, except for the ending, where all the different choices and all the relationships that you of yourself decide whether to improve or abandon or whatever results in an actual like culmination of the narrative and the choices that you made. So I'm interested in following that and saying like, if you hypothetical, if you didn't start with like Assassin's Creed Brotherhood, because I think that part of the reason why this latched on is probably because that is set in Italy, and so there's some kind of connection to that portion of your identity. Like if you had started with Mass Effect, I'm curious if you would have had the same, like if it would have latched onto you as much, because it wasn't, or Mass Effect's not historical, but the one that you were playing, there was kind of this realization of, oh, there's like pieces of me that are connected to this play space.
I think so, because if I think back to when I used to play Ocarina of Time, I know that this was happening to me as a kid, but I didn't have the words to express it. And I know that's not a role-playing game, but I could be Link. And I think it's less, like, in that case, it's less about seeing something that actually makes sense to my real life, like Ezio and Brotherhood. And more of I get to just be somebody that I'm not. And when I was a kid especially, I used to struggle a lot with like not liking who I was. So that was important, becoming something and someone else and making sense of my world through somebody else's eyes or something else. Where it became a little more prominent was Brotherhood, and that was easy because of the fact that there was like cultural connections there. So like it was a much easier sort of dive into it. But I think it still would have, regardless of whether it had been Brotherhood or any other game, probably even more so with Mass Effect, because I'd imagine that is even more intensely written and immersive from what I've been told and from what I've seen. So it probably would have been even more so the case, because I think this is just how my brain works and makes sense of things.
I want to know how this passion connects with what you're researching, because I also I also am just so far removed from the day-to-day of what it means to analyze games.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, what are you currently working on? What are you, I guess, working towards? And how does this passion, this personal connection to what you're doing, how does that come in through your research?
Actually, right now, I just finished working on a presentation for CGSA, which is totally not at all tied to my dissertation research. I analyzed Civilization 6. So right now, I'm not necessarily touching my main, my baby, as I call it, my project, because all this other stuff has started to come through. But I guess the ties into it is that typically I can't play a game without sitting there thinking about the story. And it's because I'm very much a supporter in the idea that the real way that we come to know anything as a society, and this is seen in like pretty much every culture, is through some form of storytelling. So it's important to me to figure out what's going on in games when it comes to that side of things, because they're not going away anytime soon. They're just going to become more and more complex. And I'm starting to see like maybe this is how we're starting to do the storytelling rather than through traditional novels. Not that we're not doing it that way, but it's making things more complex. We moved away from an oral tradition, at least in the Western and most Western cultures. We moved away from that to the written word, and now we're sort of combining the two is how I see it in games, and also adding like 15 billion other layers. So I don't know if that fully answered your question, but I guess that's where I see the connections is every single game that I pick up, I'm sitting there like, is there a story apparent, or am I responsible for making it myself? And then that's where I start to figure out, okay, where do I go from here?
So you are, in a way, looking at the story to try and glean something about humans.
Yes, because I don't understand humans and I want to understand them.
What kind of questions do you ask when you go to do this?
Oh, geez. I ask so many. Again, the first things I figure out is there an actual pre-written story, or am I responsible for making it myself? Because it's highly dependent on the game, right? But if we're going to take a pre-written story, I ask what methods are they using to convey the story? How are they combining what I call the language of games? So that means like that's such a loaded term because it means a billion things at once. But like how are they combining the visual elements and the hard coded mechanics, and also the actual like dialogue in the story, if there is any, or the environmental storytelling, which is an older term that who came up with
Spatial
it?
narratives.
Thank
Is what
you.
it's known as now. Yeah. That's Henry
Yes.
Jenkins.
That's who it was. Yes, Henry Jenkins. That's who I was thinking of. Yeah. So how are they combining these different types of elements for storytelling in general? And then I start picking apart the story when it's a pre-written story. I start picking apart each of those layers, as many as I can at the same time. Like, okay, so if it's environment, how are they doing it? What are they doing? What effect does it have emotionally? And what effect does it have for the overall gaming experience, which is different from the emotion? If it's dialogue, okay, so this is very standard literary studies coming through. Like, I'm going to close read the dialogue. If it's game mechanics, what is the purpose of those game mechanics? Are they helping the story, or are they just glommed on just because we need the story to make sense with this particular game mechanic? And it's basically about figuring out not necessarily what came first, but what's more prominent, and then whichever one's more prominent, how do I approach it after that? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So I guess where my mind went initially was you approach these games and you ask a very specific question. Like, just for a throwaway example, if you start playing Assassin's Creed Brotherhood, which is the one set in ancient Rome, right?
Well, yes, yeah, ancient Rome, yeah, not ancient Rome. Sorry, Renaissance Rome.
Okay, so just as a throwaway example, what I was thinking before is maybe you would go into that saying, what does this story tell us about our depiction of, I don't know, something like the architecture of Rome?
Yeah, so I will do that, but that ends up being like a sub question of a sub question of a sub question. So that typically comes a little bit later because I have to parse up, like I have to take apart the game and figure out how it's telling that story first, and
so you're not
more prominent.
So you're not necessarily designing those questions before you even sit down to play it for the first time. That's more something that emerges like ad hoc.
Yeah. Which is probably not like when I'm writing my dissertation proposal, that's probably going to get tossed out as a standard methodology. But it is very, at least so far, it's been very much like I'm just going to play it first. And then I'm going to figure out now what do I want to ask about it. And then I'm going to start replaying the game with those questions in mind. But I want to experience the game like I don't know a better word to use other than like in a virgin sense. Like I don't want anything to impact it until after I've played it at least once.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It's just fascinating because it's a different thing altogether than the assumptions that I previously had about your research. Mm-hmm. What you're doing is you are trying to investigate the story. Like when you say you're investigating the story, you really are. Yes. And everything else, the questions that come from that help shape that original investigation rather than somebody who tries to look at the story, how it informs something else. So it's a total flip.
Exactly. And I don't know which one is better or worse. I don't think it either is better or worse. But I also don't know if this is going to be a method that I use all throughout my career, because I think it's very much a developing method that I'm sort of getting away with right now. And I don't know if it's the most fruitful, but it seems to be working so far. So we'll see.
So that makes me think of, Marisa, when you and I were in Neil's game studies course 3 years ago, he often came back to this question of how much of a game do you have to play before you're able to write about it? Do you remember that idea that he would like basically every week he would bring that up? It was, what is a game and how much of a game do you have to play? That's what we just circled back to all the time. And Sabrina, what your methodology makes me think of is like, I would say you probably have to play half to 3/4 before you kind of fully understand what's going on, because I do think that narrative and mechanics are so intertwined in like probably post like first BioShock up, right? I think that's the game where people went, oh, like we can actually tell meaningful stories in games.
Yes.
And the other thought I had about that was, it's slipping away. What was it? So how much of a game do you have to play? Oh, right. Because I think that is, again, with this kind of era of modern gaming that we're in, I think that people expect to have meaningful narratives and not just, we're going to beat up enemies until we're level 100 and then start over. Mm-hmm. Because if you apply it to like film studies, right, how much of Psycho do you have to watch before you fully understand what's going on? Or like how much of Inception do you have to watch before you know what's going on? Because there's points in those narratives where shifts happen that like illuminate more of the theme that's going on underneath it. Mm-hmm. So I think I think it's interesting that you go in just kind of like, okay, let's see, you know, how this, it's almost like listening to a new record. You're just like, well, let's see how the tracks sync up and let's see how I feel. And then as you get an understanding of it, you're able to go back and say, okay, I'm looking for, you know, X, Y, and Z or kind of something.
Yeah. And it's kind of just because I like to think of these games kind of like cultural stories in the same way that like when people who study folk tales, for instance, they're like, we can study it as much as we can, but we're never actually going to fully understand, especially when it's like an ancient folk tale, what it was like to experience that and what that did, unless we experience it in the natural way it was meant to be experienced, which is why I like to at least give each game and basically I'm giving it the option to tell me what it wants to tell me.
That's really interesting. And that makes me think of, I think I was reading Hamlet on the Holodeck, which you have, if you haven't read yet, you really need to.
No, I have.
Okay. I feel like I'm like coming really late to it. Anyways, she's talking, I believe it's in that book, but she was talking about the oral traditions and how the reason why they could memorize, you know, huge books of text is because, you know, they were chunked into like stanzas, but then certain phraseology you were able to switch out depending on how the audience was responding. So that makes me think of when we talked to Pam however many months ago about The Witcher, she can't play it in English. She can only listen to it in Polish. So do you have experiences like that where you will change up the language depending on kind of what era or location these games are set and have that kind of influence how the story is told?
By language, do you mean like physical, like French or Italian or something like that?
Yeah,
or...
yeah, because you are multilingual.
Well, I sort of. I don't. Colin likes to say that I'm multilingual. I say it, but with a like an asterisk because I'm no longer fluent in Italian. And when I was fluent, it was never proper grammar. French, I am cautious to say I'm fluent just because I don't want anybody to call me out and then I get stuck and get confused. So I am fairly multilingual, but because English was my predominant language, usually I'm okay in very specific contexts. So when I'm playing Assassin's Creed, I play that in English, but I'm constantly criticizing the Italian translations because or the pronunciation. They did a really good job for the most part. And the thing with Italian is at least older renditions of Italian, it was highly regional and there was dialects all over the place. So there's only so much I can critique, but it does throw off. Like it sort of like makes me kind of pulls me out of the immersion when I see the subtitle, because I always play with subtitles on even when it's in English just because I'm basically partially deaf. So when I see the subtitle and it doesn't match exactly, and like I sit there and I'm like, I mean, I guess, but that's not true, and then I'm pulled out of the immersion. So I think because I've been lucky that English is my first language, so I haven't needed to do that yet, but I imagine eventually if the dream comes true when I move to Europe, that will absolutely be a thing, more so because I'll be using the languages more. And there are certain stories that I would prefer to hear in its original form if I can.
That's interesting. That's like when the first time I picked up Assassin's Creed Odyssey and they're speaking with that Greek accent. I don't know if it's good or bad, but then they'd start dropping the F word and stuff. I'm like, this doesn't sync up in what I envisioned it to being. Okay, and then the other thought I had, and then Marisa can get back to the scripted questions, is I think your methodology makes sense as well because single player games are more rooted in narrative, whereas online or multiplayer games, for the most part, it's more about the, you know, kind of competitive or just collaborative nature of it. And the narrative is like, yeah, it's there, but it would definitely be, you know,
the narrative is the excuse, basically.
Yeah, it's the reason to go from like this zone to this zone, but you're still doing the same things all the way through it. So
yeah, exactly. Which is fun and great, and like to some extent, I will study those types of games, but in much smaller, like for a hyper specific reason. Whereas my passion project is always the narrative single players. Because
and I do think that that's the shift in specifically RPGs with like what Larian Studios is doing with Divinity and now with the Baldur's Gate 3 license that they have from Wizards, that they're saying, you know, for 40 years it used to be you have to sit by yourself and go through this fantasy experience, but now you can do it with friends, and then that kind of it affects the entire experience as well. So I think that is the shift, because people realize, oh, we want narrative and good mechanics, not just, you know, tight gunplay and then a very loose story to take us from.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I love listening to the two of you talk about this.
You don't get to nerd out enough like
We
normally.
don't.
We always have to work.
And I find it really funny too, because we've had conversations where we're both like two sides of the same coin, but arguing very different things.
I'm thinking with you, Sabrina, your research must be so challenging to articulate in grant proposals where you have to talk about
Yep.
it before you've actually started.
Yep.
Yeah.
I hate writing my grants because it's not even just that. That's like that is already an era of difficult or a layer of difficulty. Where did era come from? Doesn't matter. A layer of difficulty. But the other layer of it is like, how do I explain why this is important when I don't know why it's important yet? So it's not even just like explaining what I'm doing, but explaining the significance before I've even gotten a chance to do it yet is freaking ridiculous. I hate
Oh,
it.
now I want to ask you that. What do you say? What do you say when you are confronted with that? Because it's on every grant proposal, and frankly, a lot of people have these questions.
Which is fair for them to have, but I want to say, I don't know. Give me a second. But no.
Pay me first, and then I'll tell you.
Yeah. On grant proposals, I typically talk about knowledge mobilization through storytelling, and that's how I'm like able to vaguely get away with it. But in person, because I'm constantly getting critiqued for why are you studying video games? What the heck? And how does that tie to English literature? I always say I'm studying the human experience using like, so when people would ask me why you're an English major, it was I'm studying the human experience as it's written through the written word. But now with the layer of video games, I'm like, I'm studying the written experience based on how it would have been written through a new format because nobody wants to read anymore. Just, I know that's not the case, but that's how I shut people down.
There's your 30-second elevator pitch. Well,
Yeah.
I suppose 10 seconds.
That's
great.
how I get
And
people to leave me alone.
Yeah, anybody who's listening to this, if you have that question genuinely, you still don't know why people do this, why it matters, I encourage you to go check out firstpersonscholar.com, read a couple of the articles, and that should solve it for you.
Absolutely. There are so many articles that basically answer all these questions in even more eloquent ways than I could ever imagine on any grant proposal.
Yeah, in essence, they answer it through demonstrating
Mm-hmm.
why it matters to study these things, because topics come up like post-colonialism in games. How is race and gender treated in games? What is
Mm-hmm.
this saying about us and where we still need to go? So,
Yes, absolutely. And we're actually going to be publishing a special issue about BIPOC, trans, and queer experiences in games, which I think will give a really, really interesting like perspective that hasn't quite been done yet extensively. So I'm excited for that special issue coming out sometime in the summer. I forget when, but it'll be on the website.
we will amplify it somehow through the podcast.
Yes.
What is your role with First Person Scholar?
I am the EIC, or editor-in-chief, and I'll be continuing that position, but this time I'll get an official co-EIC because currently Patrick is managing editor, but we basically do all of the same, like we do the work evenly. So I said, screw it. We're just both going to be EIC because this difference in position titles doesn't make sense when we're both doing it. Which means it's a very fancy way of saying we do way too much work. We are responsible for, I actually wrote an entire list. It's way too long, but basically we're responsible for the general direction of where FPS goes now and in near future. Yeah.
Does that mean you are attracting contributors or you're curating contributors?
I don't, luckily, this is going to sound so arrogant. Luckily, I don't need to attract contributors. FPS has been long established. I think this year is our 10th year. Yeah, we're on 10 years now. So I don't need to do any of that work. But in reality, yes, that is something that I would be doing. But we also curate a little bit. We typically accept a lot of various types of submissions, but we curate sort of the general feel. So even though we're fielding a lot of different topics, it's more of like this is the overall feel of the publication, whether we want to feel ultra one way versus like a middle ground. And that's why we call ourselves a middle state, because we do like that middle ground of somewhat experiential, but also somewhat scholarly. It's a really nice area to be in, especially when you're studying games.
Great. Okay. My brain is spinning. We've covered a lot in a short amount of time. We only have 10 minutes left. I still have, how many questions do we still have left? Like 4 or 5.
4.
So, well, we will, let's just say that at some point in the future we'll do a follow-up, because these aren't rapid fire questions. But what I can do, I'll collapse 2 of them into one.
Okay.
Yeah. So we were going to ask, what role does streaming have in your research? And we were going to ask, what games are you currently playing? So let's collapse those and say, what games are you currently streaming, and what role does it have in your research?
So last week I streamed Nier Automata. I have to still decide if that's what I'm going to be doing again this week. I want to say yes, because it's cool, and also because my partner's home and he's the one who's getting me into it. So streaming started as like an experiential like research creation. Thanks, Marisa, for that term, because I didn't know it back in the day. You're the one who gave me that term. And it's basically about communal storytelling. So I haven't quite seen it come to fruition yet. And that's just because I have to start structuring my stream slightly differently. But what I do is when we start talking on the stream about stories, I actually field those responses from the chat. And that sort of helps me figure out like how is it a community experiencing the story, not just me, because I can experience it all I want in one way, but that might not be the same as somebody else. So what I have to say is kind of just like one jerk's opinion, not necessarily the opinion. So streaming is cool because then I can start seeing, are other people agreeing with me or not? I don't know if that makes sense.
That's really cool. That makes sense to me.
Thanks.
Yeah, it cuts out the wait time to have any kind of reader response of your
basically
ideas.
Yeah, it also makes it so that you can pull in a reciprocal method into your research. A lot of the time, this is something that comes up in different games research, right? Games require the player experience to really understand them. I think a lot of people would say that that's part of the definition, although Neil would say, oh, maybe not, but whatever. And so people struggle with this thing where they need to understand how players interact with it, and then they need to pull it back into their research, and then they need to try again and see how players interact with that change, and then they pull it back. And it's such a long process requiring a lot of iterations. But what you're effectively doing is you're making it happen together synchronously.
Yes. I'm very much a I believe that the best research is done when you just start talking to people and asking them about it, and that's where you actually like get really significant. I sound like such an abolitionist for the traditions of the ivory tower. I'm not entirely, I should say. That's not what I'm getting at. What I'm getting at is there's new ways, especially with game studies, to conduct the research, and I would love for it to just be normal to just stream and like that's my published work. And that way I don't have to write about it after. Like, I know that sounds ridiculous, but like you can get such fruitful conversations when you just let people talk directly to you while it's happening, rather than like, okay, I'm going to take the data that I got from this and then publish about it and then wait for some other, regular Joe like me to respond to it. I guess not regular Joes. We're all scholars. But whatever, wait for somebody else to respond to it. That takes too long. I would rather everybody just joins in at the pot and we all just talk, and it would be great. And we could all have some drinks and have a cool time.
That's beautiful. We should plan in our, I don't know what you call it, like our ideal fantasy future, a Games Institute podcast live stream.
Yes.
And do something that's more interactive. And I think it's really cool what you're saying, how there's new methods emerging. And there's also new ways to disseminate that are emerging. And we see this with Jen's research too, right? She goes to BlizzCon to interact with people one-to-one. Well, she goes when it's not a pandemic.
What? Yes.
And that's another way that you can pull people into the conversation as the research process. And when I think about the folks who probably need it more, I'm thinking the games user researchers. And doing it from the game studies lens is just fascinating. There's so many other avenues to explore.
Yeah, 100%. And I don't think they're being used enough. Like they like take advantage of this beautiful thing. Please, for the love of God.
Oh, and I can't believe we only have 5 minutes left. So for the listeners, Sabrina was invited and wants to go and speak in Marcelo Gorman's class about first-person scholar.
Yes.
So
I'm very excited to do that.
We're very jealous to share your time.
Honestly, I'd love to do a follow-up if I'm ever invited for that. This was so much fun, and I really, really appreciate the invite.
Before we let you go, Tobin, you want to fire our closing question?
Yeah, because this will take the rest of the 5 minutes. If you could have everyone in the world play one game, what would it be?
You're going to get so mad at me for this. Ocarina of Time! That is the only game that matters. That's why my dad always says that I'm getting a PhD in Zelda.
We had Leonard last week, 2 weeks. I don't remember when we recorded, but he said Breath of the Wild, so we're on like a good trend, which you haven't played yet. So get on that too. Gosh, you need to play Mass Effect and you Breath of the Wild.
I get why Breath of the Wild, but I have problems with it. But also, I do need to play it. But it's not a Zelda game. I'm not getting into this.
Leonard interpreted it differently than we've ever had anybody interpret it. He thought we meant if you could have everybody in the world play one game together. At the same time.
What did he say for that?
Sweet.
I think he did. He said Overcooked because that would be hilarious and chaotic.
6 billion people in one kitchen trying to serve soup.
That would be so funny. Oh my goodness.
But I guess we can spin that too and say if you could have everybody watch you stream a game, would it still be Ocarina of Time?
Ooh, maybe not. I actually don't know what game it would be. It would have to be something with a very, very like Ocarina of Time is just that's just my I just have a bias with that one. It's just a beautiful, amazing game in so many ways. But I think for the purpose of that stream, the way I want it to work, I would need more time to think about that because it would have to be a very, very narrative heavy game. I would love to try it with Horizon Zero Dawn. I don't know that would be the best one though, but it is an incredible game.
So, where can people find you online? Where can people find you on First Person Scholar and Twitch?
You can find me at Sabrina Alicia SG, I'm pretty sure is my Twitter. You can find me at FPS Weekly as well. I basically help manage the Twitter account, so if chances are you're probably going to interact with me if you interact with the FPS Twitter, or EIC at firstpersonscholar.com. Also reviews at firstpersonscholar.com because we don't have a reviews editor, so that's now my job. If you want to apply for any positions at First Person Scholar, please reach out to me because we need people. And then in terms of my stream, you can find me either twitch.tv/firstpersonscholar on Fridays 4:15 to 6, or for twitch.tv/brainiacbree, definitely Fridays 4:15 to 6, and then whenever else I feel like doing it.